Tragedy struck the Margaree Harbour in Tasmania, Australia, as 470 pilot whales were found stranded in the harbour. 110 have been saved, which is actually quite amazing. And we're going to talk about that and why pilot whales have been known to strand in this area as well as in New Zealand. On this episode of Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast, let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Today we're talking about a tragedy that hit Tasmania. 470 pilot whales were found stranded in Margaree Harbour on last Sunday. So this has been a week that's been going on. 200 pilot whales were actually found stranded, and then 200 carcasses were found 2 days later just further in the harbor. Pilot whales have been known to strand in this harbor before. The last stranding that was a record was 1996, involving involving 320 pilot whales in Western Australia. So it's just an amazing thing to see when you have this many pilot whales coming in. We're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about why they strand, why pilot whales. We're going to talk about what rescue efforts are meant for that, how they're saved, and then what they do with the carcasses of some of the 200 at least that have not survived. So we're going to talk about that on today's episode. So let's get into it. Before we do, though, I just want to say, this is a network of podcasts that we have here, Speak Up for Blue. The Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast is our flagship podcast, but we have Marine Conservation Happy Hour, which this week we are going to be talking about this stranding, and we're also going to be talking a little bit about, on Tuesday's episode, we're going to be talking about orcas and how orcas have been attacking boats, a specific type of boat in the Strait of Gibraltar. We talked about it a little bit on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail with Kraken McCrack, aka Chris Parsons, Dr. Chris Parsons, who's a marine mammal biologist and has been looking into this issue, as well as his wife, Dr. Naomi Rose. So we're going to be talking to Chris about that, and it's going to be a great episode, so don't forget to check that out. Also, don't forget, we had a podcast published for Marine Mammal Science. If you love these marine mammal podcasts, we're actually talking about statistical data and how it's important when you're looking at marine mammals and studying marine mammals. And of course, we had the Madam Curiosity post last week, and that was on how art is used in science communication and how women in art have really been able to do a good job in having a career. They're going to be talking to Dugongs and Sea Dragons podcaster Aaron Z. Henderson, and so you're going to get to hear from that. So there's so much content that we put out on a weekly basis. Check that out. I'm going to be revamping our Patreon so that everybody can get an RSS feed that has all of our episodes, so you don't miss it. You don't have to subscribe to a number of different shows. So keep an eye out for that. But today, let's get back into our episode, Tragedy in Tasmania. This is something we've seen before. We've talked about in the podcast before, where pilot whales in New Zealand, their specific spot in Louisiana, in New Zealand, where they continue to, they strand every once in a while. But when they strand, a lot of times they strand in big numbers. Now, I did a couple of reading some articles, and there was an article in the Guardian that talked about why pilot whales and why they strand themselves. And although the reasons are really difficult to tell right off the bat, we have to really talk about what pilot whales are. And understand that they're not actually whales. Dr. Emma Betty, who's from the Cetacean Ecology Research Group at Massey University in New Zealand, she says the name doesn't really fit. They say they're actually a large dolphin. She said all their life history and evolution makes them more related to a bottlenose dolphin than to something like a humpback whale. That's a direct quote from The Guardian. And Betty is an expert on the life history of longfin pilot whales and stranding events. Much of what is known about the species, she says, comes from stranding events because they are a deep water species. They tend to sit and eat fish and squid that are below 200 meters, but can dive to up to 1,000 meters and hold their breath for up to a half an hour, which is insane. Think about that. I think when humans, when we do as kids, we try and hold our breath for as long as possible. A lot of us make it under a minute. Some people, I don't know what the longest breath has been taken, but I think it's like 4 minutes or so. But that's really difficult to do, especially in like dark, cold water and deep water too. Like these animals can hold themselves. It's unreal. Normally they spend time in pods, about 20 or 30, but sometimes formed what they call temporary super pods of about 1,000 individuals. And they said the behavior, she says, this is what Betty says, probably to help them feed en masse and to avoid interbreeding. So a lot of genetic diversity is increased when you're around animals that are not part of your specific pod, your family pod. So you're increasing your genetics there and increasing the strength of that population in that area. So evidence suggests female pilot whales can live to 40 years or more, about 10 years longer than males. And the females are the dominant females are they're usually the ones who run their pod, and they can use echolocation to communicate. They can learn the group. They can alert the group to a food source, potential danger, or that one of them is in distress. So essentially what happens if you have you have the super pod and you have dominant females who are running this pod, and all of a sudden they get stressed out or they get distressed or they get lost chasing some fish, and all of a sudden they come across these high sloping areas, meaning that the slope of the topography of the bottom of the seabed kind of goes up pretty quickly, and they're chasing fish using echolocation because they can't really see 200 meters down or within that 200 to 1,000 meters down and below, and all of a sudden they come up and they're stuck in a harbor like Marquarrie Harbor. Then they can get into a big trouble. Also, if the animal's distressed, if the dominant female is distressed, these animals will follow that distressed animal all the way into a harbor. And sometimes a marine mammal will beach themselves when they're not doing too well. They lose their echolocation, they lose their navigation, and they end up beached either somewhere on a beach along the shore, or they may be in a harbor if they get up really close. So that can lead the rest of the pod into some danger, which we think happens in these mass strandings, right? And so when they get stuck in these areas, they can't figure out how to get out. They're following these potentially distressed females. And that's just one explanation. This is not necessarily what happened in Tasmania this past week, but it could be. It could be that. And then, of course, you get 470 animals that are basically stuck, which is obviously not a good thing. It's not something that we want to see. Now, this happens every once in a while. It doesn't happen all the time, but it seems like these super pods are getting bigger and bigger, and it seems like they're stranding, and so that takes away a lot of the population. They said they found 200 dead so far. They've been able to float 110, which means they're floating them out at sea. They're getting them going. That doesn't happen without coordinated rescue efforts. And in Thursday's Marine Conservation Happy Hour, Kraken talks a lot about how floating and how these networks that they have in the UK, that they have in Tasmania, that they have in the US, in New Zealand, in Australia, they have these stranding networks that people volunteer. They do a lot of work to make sure that they understand not only the occupational health and safety that's involved with working with marine mammals, whether they be cetaceans or pinnipeds like seals and sea lions, but they understand how to make sure you check for vitals, how to make sure you alert other people to come to help, how to make sure you know how to float, and also protect yourself while you go out there. These are massive animals. Even though they're dolphin-like, these animals are still pretty big. They're probably about, I'd say 6-7 feet, maybe 8 feet long, maybe even longer, and they're pretty hefty. They're pretty hefty animals, so you can't really float one out on your own. You probably need a lot of people to help. There are a number of pictures on the Guardian, on the Guardian article, which I will link to 2 articles that I read for this episode, and you'll be able to see some of the pictures of what the whales look like and how many people it takes. I'm looking at one picture, and there's about 6 people that are looking after one animal that's beached right up to the beach and not even in the water as much. So, you always worry about dry skin on these animals. You worry about their vitals. There's so much to worry about. And when you're trying to lift them back into the ocean or on a truck where you can put them back in the water, or if they're a carcass, you have to put them back in the water as well. In this situation, which we'll get into a second, you're probably looking at maybe 12 individuals trying to bring them back up on the truck. So this is something that is not something that's for one individual person to help. You need a coordinated effort, and these stranding networks are indeed very good at that kind of communication. They're always running training events, and that's just something that you can join yourself. If you live along the coastline, it doesn't matter where along the coastline, if you have cetaceans or pinnipeds that wash up on the beach or are close in and around the beaches, you can be part of those networks. I know the British Divers Rescue. Oh God, I forget the name. Anyway, I'll post a link to their website. I know British Divers Rescue are a very good organization in the UK, and there are probably some other organizations. I'll try and find them along in Australia as well as the US. NOAA is usually in charge of a lot of those stranding networks, but you have people who can call into those networks and understand, and you get to understand where you can call those numbers and so forth to make sure that you can get people out there. If you're not trained in this type of situation, you can get people out there to look after those animals as soon as possible, because when it comes to these animals beaching, time is of the essence. You want to make sure that you get that stranding network out there so that they can help float them back. Now, 110 animals going back, that is that's pretty darn good to get these pilot whales going back out into the ocean safely. Of course, they have to monitor to make sure those animals don't end up back in there. If they get disoriented again, they could probably end up going back into the harbor. Apparently, 200 of the carcasses that have been disposed of are disposed in another bay about a few miles away. Let me just see where that was. 200 carcasses were towed by several boats out of the harbor on Sunday, with authorities hopeful of removing the remainder before Wednesday, when bad weather is due to set in. Working on the West Coast is extremely weather dependent. We've got the wildest ocean in the world at our front door. We've got work within those constraints. So the modeling, the CSIRO, which is the sort of the NOAA of Australia, the government organization that looks at a lot of the science, a lot of the modeling. Has been used to these modeling has been used to determine the best spot to dump the whales, a stretch of between 5 to 10 nautical miles west of Cape Sorel is where they're going. What they're worried about, though, is as those get disposed of, they go out to sea. They may end up being back on the beach, and so there'll be networks looking for those as well. So they're obviously worried about these animals. They're also worried when they float these animals out where they're going to go. Do they end up coming back along the shore? Is it something that they end up going out and they're fine? There's really not a lot of history on that. And in fact, there's not even a database on stranding networks, according to this article. Or not stranding networks, but stranding databases. So we don't really know if this is a record. They're saying it's a record because 470 individuals that were stranded. So as of this article, it's been a record, but they don't know if this is the highest. Obviously, it's not a good record to break, but it's something that we need to look after, because is this going to just continue to increase as we go further down the road? And we see things like climate change, things like food availability, change in currents, all that plays a role in where these pilot whales' food are going to be, how deep these animals go in terms of their prey, and where they're going to go if they can't go down below. So there's a lot of factors that go into this into the future, and having a database of strandings, historical strandings as well as future strandings, would be ideal to just track this information. I'm sure you can build on that database. So that's what we're going to hopefully see in the future with a lot of these strandings, is to see a database so that we can start monitoring this and seeing if these are the largest, if they're getting bigger, if there's a trend. Hopefully there's a trend that it'll go down and there will be less frequent ones. But it's always good to monitor these types of things, but that costs money, that costs people, and that's something that is not freely available these days. Maybe people. I'm sure there's a lot of people that would love to see this track, but the funding for that is definitely few and far between. But anyway, that's it for today's episode. Love to hear what you think on this. Do you think that there should be a database? Do you think that this should be monitored by an organization or governments to make sure that we know where these animals are coming from, where they're going, how many there are, how they're being stranded, how the network has been responding to them, how many people in that network? All that kind of stuff would be, I think, interesting to know. and to see in the future how these things changes and trends. But I'd like to hear from you. Go to the Speak Up for Blue Facebook group at speakupforblue.com/group and let us know what you think of this episode, as well as any other episode you want. You want to talk about the ocean? We can talk about the ocean. I'm in there quite often. Other people are in there quite often. We're here to talk. We're here to listen, and it's always fun to do that. So speakupforblue.com/group. And of course, if you want to hear any of the other shows and from any of our other wonderful hosts in the Speak Up for Blue podcast network, you can do so by either going to speakupforblue.com/network, or you can just look at any of the links in the show notes below or on your app that you're listening to this episode on, and you'll be able to go to any of those shows. So thank you so much for joining us here on the Speak Up for the Ocean Blue podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you on Wednesday, and happy conservation.